Good morning, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this webinar on accelerating Asia's growth and artificial intelligence and cloud technologies. My name is Rolando Avendaño. I am an economist with the Economic Research and Development Impact Department of ADB. And the topic of today builds on research recently published by ADB on the topic of AI and cloud technologies. In this seminar, we will explore how AI and cloud technologies are driving long-term economic transformation. We will understand and also explore the combined potential of AI and cloud adoption on innovation, productivity, and inclusive growth. And we will discuss the role of forward-looking policies in enabling a sustainable framework for these technologies. For the structure of the seminar, we will have first a presentation to set the scene, about 20 to 25 minutes, followed by a panel discussion. Let me please introduce first our presenter and panelists. So we will welcome Raul Katz, who will make the main presentation. He is president of Telecom Advisory Services in New York. And for the panel discussion, we have a very rich group of experts. Natasha Beschorner, Public Sector Policy Lead for Asia and the Pacific from Amazon. We have from our department, Donghyun Park, Economic Advisor from the Economic Research and Development Impact Department, and also John Beirne, a Principal Economist of the same Economic Research Department. And finally, Yoonee Jeong, who is Senior Digital Technology Specialist for the Digital Sector Office in ADB. With this, let me please first give the floor to Raul to make his presentation. Over to you, Raul.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Let me share my screen. And please confirm that you're seeing it properly.
Yes. Okay.
Yeah, so a little bit as Rolando was anticipating, our issue, the focus is, there are two items that I want to emphasize throughout the presentation. One is that both cloud computing and artificial intelligence do have an impact on the economy, with examples of Asia Pacific in comparison with other countries. And secondly, if that is to be the case, what has to happen from a policy standpoint to stimulate the development and adoption of these technologies? Just to start and to set the definitional aspects, particularly when it comes to artificial intelligence, we're talking about machine learning and other technologies that rely on data to train models that are basically statistical engines for the purpose of performing tasks. Machine learning allows it to build prediction on models and therefore develop a number of use cases that are very important, let's say in manufacturing and financial services and government efficiency. Generative AI takes it a step further because it can create new content, ideas, and many of us are obviously very familiar with that, having used on ChatGPT and other technologies to gain access to advice, search, and the like. On the right-hand side, you see a number of use cases beyond what us consumers might apply these technologies to rely on. They are very important applications, both in the areas of education, healthcare, analytics as a whole, and government efficiency and public services that are very critical. So the span of impact that these technologies have goes well beyond the kind of uses that us consumers might be inclined to rely on. On the cloud side, essentially what we have is entering into a paradigm of shared computing power, sharing IT services by either enterprises or governments in order to have the ability to either leverage economies of scale by virtue of linking several facilities into a single IT infrastructure. And that also provides the capability to scale up the adoption of technology and not having to rely on the fixed capital each time we need to upgrade the facilities. It also has impact on the development of new products and obviously cost reduction of software development. So as you can see, these two technologies are critical in terms of adoption and the economics of IT and provision of services, both on the public realm and on the private enterprises. Now, we talk about cloud computing and artificial intelligence in tandem because, in fact, they are what we call complementary technologies. In a way, there couldn't be artificial intelligence if we didn't have the enormous capacity that cloud computing services allow to, precisely because artificial intelligence is, let's call it, a resource-hungry application that requires the processing of millions of data, billions of parameters in order to deliver the service. In addition to that, as you can see in this Venn diagram, we have a subset within artificial intelligence of what we just defined as generative artificial AI. And both AI segments rely directly on cloud computing. So we're going to talk throughout the presentation about this complementarity of these two technologies that cannot be understood independently. Our presentation is going to be structured in three areas beyond the definitions that I just talked about. First, give you a little bit of a sense of how is Asia and the Pacific proceeding in terms of adoption of these technologies. As a definitional issue, we are defining adoption, or we're measuring adoption by looking at spending. Spending in terms of the overarching purchasing of hardware, servers, software, and obviously cloud computing services and the like. We're going to talk about the association between both on a sort of a descriptive statistical standpoint, but then we're going to move to the second area, which is trying to show the relationship that exists between adoption of these technologies and economic growth. Finally, as I mentioned before, if the second item is actually proven, the issue is how can we accelerate that in Asia Pacific and obviously around the world as well. So we're going to focus a little bit on the public policy standpoint. Just to set the record from a quantitative standpoint, Asia Pacific today roughly spends around 34% of the world's spending of artificial intelligence is focused on Asia Pacific, while 16% of cloud computing is focused on the region. You see the range going from obviously the People's Republic of China that is a big center of spending on both technologies, but there are other technologies that are very important throughout the region. But if you look at it as a whole, 34% of AI spending is quite a bit of a large number. More importantly, if you look at the trend, and if you focus on the chart on the left, what you see when we are normalizing the spending on a number 100 in 2019 and seeing what the growth rate indicates is precisely that both North America and Asia Pacific are the regions of the world that are growing the fastest around the world. Obviously, within North America, the United States is its largest component, while in Asia Pacific, the People's Republic of China is. But nevertheless, having said that, the two regions of the world are the ones that are growing the fastest, and that translates on the chart on the right when you see actually the amount of spending that goes in the case of AI within Asia Pacific, $75 billion relative to $113 billion in the case of North America. Clearly, there appears to be a relationship, and I'm being very careful about that, a relationship between level of economic development and AI spending. And I'm saying I'm being careful because this is not just more than descriptive statistics, but would indicate that the richer a country is, and you see some of those are included in Europe, the more spending occurs. But we don't know which way the causality goes or works. And in fact, it could go either way. But so far, there's clearly an association when it comes to AI spending. If you shift to cloud computing, similar trends occur, but if you look at the difference and try to remember what was happening in AI, clearly cloud computing is homogeneously growing around the world with very different patterns of growth across regions. That being said, Asia Pacific is behind Europe when it comes to cloud computing spending. Again, when we look at the relationship between the level of development of an economy and cloud computing spending, there is clearly a relationship between both parameters. I emphasize association and not causality. Now, the interesting thing is, and sort of like supporting the topic that there's no AI development without cloud computing. If you look at both metrics of AI spending and cloud spending as a percent of the total spending around the world, there's clearly a relationship. The more a region spends on cloud as a percent of the world's demand, the more it'll spend on AI. And when you focus about what sectors are actually benefiting from that spending, in the case of AI, clearly you see pretty much a center of gravity being on financial services and the whole ICT world. We're not surprised by that because the information and communications technology sector is one that is more prone to adopt, experiment, and incorporate these technologies within its performance. And obviously financial services, because the nature of adoption of information processing facilities requires the incorporation of these technologies. Lastly, just one should emphasize that generative AI, as you remember, is that field within artificial intelligence that allows for create content and propose actions on the part of agents that serve consumers or provide responses to our inquiries. Clearly, generative AI is increasing year after year the portion of total AI spending. That is, again, one of the centers of gravity of the overall artificial intelligence world. Let's move to the second item in the presentation, trying to tease out whether there is a causal link between artificial intelligence and cloud and economic development. In order to do that, we need to differentiate between two items. On the top of both, we're going to look at spending, because spending is sort of like the direct impact that occurs on the GDP by virtue of the fact that both governments and enterprises are actually acquiring the technology that has an impact on the economy per se. But the second, and that's the lower level explanation in this chart, is that beyond the direct spending, those technologies have a spillover impact on the economy as a whole, meaning that the adoption of the technologies has an impact on productivity, efficiencies, even economic growth along all ranges of the different forces that drive GDP growth. And for that, in order to actually estimate the spillover impact of these technologies, we have to rely on econometrics. If we stay on a descriptive level, we can see that AI spending has an impact both on productivity of labor and capital. But let's focus more importantly on the econometrics. We built a model, and that's described in some of the materials that we've already made public, that actually links the contribution to productivity as driven by investment in fixed capital, obviously AI spending and cloud spending at the bottom. But more importantly, rather than relying on labor as a single item, we decouple labor in terms of two areas. Skilled labor, which is defined as workers with tertiary education, and unskilled labor, which is defined as the percent of labor force that does not have tertiary education. And what we do is we build causal models that aim at estimating the impact that will have each of these components on the right-hand side on productivity. The results are quite enlightening. First is that both, particularly AI spending and cloud spending, have an impact on GDP. And purely in terms of outlining the coefficients, As you see on the right-hand side of the chart, 1% increase in AI spending will increase GDP by 0.03%. And in the case of cloud, 0.01. It's interesting that you can see how AI is increasingly having a faster impact on economic growth than cloud per se does. But obviously, AI requires an intermediate input, the use of cloud, because as I said at the beginning of the presentation, there wouldn't be AI if we didn't have cloud computing services. Now, the more important thing, or in addition to the importance of highlighting the impact on growth, is what happens with labor. And in fact, the models indicate that there is an element of substitution. And we are jumping here in the conclusions in the center of the economic, that is, on the discussion on the economics of labor as a result of the adoption of these technologies. Interestingly enough, the last two Nobel Prizes, last year's and this one, are somewhat positioned at opposite ends of the argument relative to what could happen with skilled labor or unskilled labor as a result of the adoption, particularly of AI. What our models indicate, though, is that there is, looking at the process, and our range of data goes from 2019 to 2023, there is a substitution between skilled and unskilled labor, meaning that the big levers of impact on productivity is the contribution of AI to skilled labor in terms of its performance. And as a result of the combination of skilled labor and artificial intelligence, there is less of a need of unskilled labor and therefore a process of substitution. These conclusions, to some degree, is supported by historical data evidence. You have to recognize that the data that was used to develop these models ended 2023, which in fact shows us the beginning of the development of generative AI. You might recall that ChatGPT was introduced to the market in October of 2022. So, but in general, what we see from a historical standpoint is that as a result of the adoption of ICT technologies, there has been a reduction in routine employment, generally fulfilled by unskilled labor, across some of the examples that occur primarily in looking at US data series. That's the sort of the highlighted section of the chart on the top. But even when when researchers have done assessments at the case study level, looking at the macroeconomic results of substitution, we also see that there is a reduction on routine occupations, generally fulfilled by unskilled labor. So one could say that based on historical data evidence, the trends and the case study research, there is somewhat of a support to the results that this model is indicating, primarily that the levers of impact on economic development are going to be AI supporting skilled labor, skilled workers. Now, this has obviously implications. This has very important implications relative to what's going to happen with the unskilled labor and how do we have to work in terms of promoting the skilling and reskilling of workers to be able to incorporate themselves in this new universe of production that is being supported by artificial intelligence and cloud computing. What you see in this chart is basically a disaggregation based on World Bank data between skilled and unskilled labor, with the numbers indicate the number of unskilled laborers, obviously on the formal sector, because those are the ones that can be measured for each of the countries in the region. We haven't included here PRC, but you can see pretty much the range across the different areas of the region. Clearly, some countries, be it Korea, Japan, and even Australia, are privileged by the fact that their proportion of skilled workforce is larger than the unskilled workforce, and therefore have the ability to actually, well, on one hand, be less disrupted by the introduction of AI, and more importantly, more able to lever the impact of AI in terms of further economic growth. But the others will have to deal with it. And not that being said, all countries will have to deal with the issues of social disruption. When you look at the simulations that can be implemented based on the coefficients that I presented before, you see the impact. And it's very important to understand that spillovers, meaning the impact on productivity, is much larger than the spending per se, the direct spending of these technologies. This is really when you get the returns on the adoption of technology. Interestingly enough, if you focus on some of the AI portions of the chart, you see that the spillovers are much larger than the spending per se for each of these AI sections of the chart, while in the case of cloud, it is not as important. What we have here is, as I mentioned at the beginning, cloud computing is more mature, obviously, than artificial intelligence. And also, one has to consider that, in a way, cloud is an intermediate input for the provision of artificial intelligence. So, in a way, one has to look at cloud not independently, but in terms of combination with the other technologies. But the issue to recall is how the impact on productivity is much larger than the spending, the direct spending on these technologies. When you look on a country-by-country basis, clearly those countries that have more adoption of artificial intelligence and cloud have a larger impact on the GDP as percent of the overall output. And these are the numbers for 2024, but that gives us a range, Singapore being one of the leading countries in terms of adoption, particularly of AI, but so is Australia and Japan. And the impact that it occurs on the GDP as a result of those spillovers is critical. So then we get to the last point of the presentation. If the impact on the economy is critical, what do we do on a public policy that can stimulate the development and adoption of these two technologies? In general, what we've done is we try to formalize a number of public policies that would foster the adoption of the technologies, both in the public sector and the private sector. And we looked at the impact that that would have both in labor productivity, primarily labor productivity. We still don't see that much of an impact in capital productivity, but that's because of the earlier stages that we are at. And by virtue of introducing those policies which stimulate adoption, what would the impact be on economic growth and primarily on labor productivity? And these are the results. The results are on the left. Policies that will stimulate adoption of AI, which have been formalized. I'm going to talk a little bit about that in my later slide, and on policy reform stimulating the development of cloud computing. But in general, what you see is that if you were to implement those policies, that is directly linked for increased adoption, which in turn will have an impact on economic growth. In this case, we're just measuring the impact on spending, which, as you recall, is just the first step on the economic impact, the direct one. Then obviously you'll have all the other spillover effects. So what are the things that we could do in order to stimulate adoption? Clearly, there are two areas that we have to work on. And in a way, they actually focus on the two aspects of the conclusion that I tried to highlight. On one hand, because these technologies are important in terms of stimulating economic growth, we have to do as much as we can in terms of maximizing adoption. And that goes about public and private collaboration. So there's a way by which there's a cross-fertilization on use cases. There tools to measure adoption across geographies, standardizing them, relaxing some data localization requirements, which sometimes puts a damper on the adoption on cloud particularly, blueprints and sandbox that would help particularly small and medium enterprises to adopt this technology, which who don't have the resources that actually are required to adopt particularly artificial intelligence, and all the tax incentives and credits that would allow to fine-tune and stimulate adoption. But at the same time, we have to work on the labor side, particularly for mitigate whatever social disruption might occur as a result of these skill to unskill substitution that I was highlighting before. We need to understand how many people we're going to need, because clearly the worst thing that could happen is that skills become somewhat of a tamper on the adoption of technology. We need to incorporate training, particularly understanding what kind of skills we need. And this is very challenging because, in a way, this is a field, particularly artificial intelligence, that is changing by the months. People that are recruiting talent from universities tell us that probably they have to spend between 6 months and a year to retrain the staff that comes from universities because they haven't been yet exposed to some of the newer trends in AI adoption. We need to look at an audit of existing readiness of the training programs, which is the other side of the coin of my prior point. And finally, we have to incentivize employers and employees to participate in skilling and reskilling programs. That governments have a big role to play in that particular area. But in addition, the private sector. How do I work going to create the right structure so their employees gain access to the particular training that they are required to be part of this new revolution? And this is a little bit my conclusion, and I will yield it back to Rolando to conduct the discussion.
Thank you, Raul, for this very insightful presentation. A lot of findings, and as we can see from the Q&A, we have already a number of questions. Please feel free to add your questions in the chat, and we will address them after or during the panel discussion. Let me now invite our panelists to the panel discussion. And I would like to start with Natasha to address one of the points that were mentioned during Raul's presentation on the role of governments. One of the key enablers for AI adoption is how governments procure these technologies. How are public government and public procurement systems evolving to keep pace, and what lessons can we draw from the region? Over to you, Natasha.
Thanks very much. This is a really important question because so many governments are interested in adopting AI, adopting cloud, but then they face traditional systems for procurement that are really not designed for these services. It's very important to remember that cloud and AI are really that services on demand. You pay for what you use, you pay for what you need as and when you need it. It is not something that you buy and you own in the way that governments traditionally would buy hardware and software, your traditional IT. So the governments that are making headway in this area are those that have really worked to change the way that they procure cloud and AI services. And we see some examples in Asia Pacific, for example, in Japan, in Singapore, in Malaysia. Philippines is working on this at the moment. Australia has developed a very mature cloud procurement framework. So what I could basically highlight as some of the best practices is that your starting point would be that the government has some form of cloud first policy or cloud by default policy that says to government agencies, this is what you need to think about procuring rather than spending a lot of money on hardware and software licenses, etc. So then what is the most efficient way of procuring these services? And what we've seen is that having regulations and legislations that allow for framework contracts with cloud services providers, for multi-year agreements, for multi-year contracts, for multi-year budgets. What they do is they typically accredit cloud service providers based on international cybersecurity standards. And so global traditional providers would have to go through a kind of certification or empanelment process. And then the government would sign framework agreements with multiple cloud service providers to make it much easier for government agencies that then want to procure the services to refer back to these framework agreements and use these as vehicles to meet their specific needs. Because if you take a traditional procurement approach to these services, then you're looking at, sometimes 6 to 12 month processes for buying particular systems. And if you want to roll out a service, if you want to quickly roll out a health monitoring program or a vaccine program or a lifelong learning program, then you don't have the luxury of time. Another key lesson that I'll leave you with is it's very important for having this form of procurement effectively coordinated across governments. So governments that have done this very successfully, such as Japan and Singapore, they've established a lead agency that is responsible for coordinating and managing the procurement of cloud and AI services. So again, providing guidance to other agencies, aggregating demand for agencies. So I'll stop there, but certainly if there are more questions, I'll be happy to respond to those. Thank you.
Thank you, Natasha. And very important points on upgrading our procurement systems and the coordination of agencies. Let me now move to Tom, and the question is more related to your research on AI. In your opinion, what is the single most important factor that will maximize the economic benefit of AI and cloud computing in Asia? You are muted.
Sorry. Thanks a lot, Rolando. Yeah. Let me start by talking about what I think developing countries, including those in Asia, should not prioritize when it comes to augmenting the economic benefits of AI, right? And that is this idea is gaining currency in some developing countries, including some in Asia, unfortunately. And it is to build sovereign AI in what they call sovereign AI infrastructure, right? This is to build a whole national, like Indonesian AI infrastructure for Indonesia, Korean AI infrastructure for Korea, and so forth. But this, to me, doesn't make any sense. This is just big white elephant with very few benefits for the economy. It will benefit NVIDIA, right? Because they can sell more high AI chips to those countries. It will certainly benefit some people in the government, right? Especially if there are governance issues. So it becomes because these are huge, very expensive, right? Costs huge amounts of money. So it becomes a honeypot for corruption. So I think this is something that countries should not do, developing countries in Asia. Now, in response to your question, the single most important benefit or ways to expand the single most important mechanism to expand the benefits, right, of economic benefits of AI is actually expanding adoption. So, of course, we all know that US is the gold medal, China is a distant silver medal now, and there are a whole bunch of other countries below them. But that, for most of developing Asia, is not such a relevant point. Really, the focus should be on expanding everyday AI so that the companies and the individuals and Asian governments can use AI productively, and that does not require building sovereign AI infrastructure. What it does require is to helping businesses, especially small and medium businesses, learn how to use AI more productively, train workers in at least basic AI skills, and last but not least, for the government, right? Governments of the region to use AI to improve the quality and efficiency of public service delivery. So the focus for developing Asia in maximizing the benefits from AI should really be on adoption, expanding adoption, helping the society, the individuals, businesses, and governments to use AI in a productive way. And that, I think, is the most important thing. Back to you, Rolando. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom. So expanding the adoption of AI as a key point and also avoiding the sovereign AI temptation, let's say. Yoonee, I will now move to you. You are very much involved in the operations of ADB in digital transformation. And the question is on how many of our member countries, they still face gaps to benefit from AI, cloud computing, as it was mentioned by Tom. How can these interventions by ADB be more effective to support both government and private sector to take the advantage of these technologies?
Thanks, Rolando, and I do appreciate Tom's intervention in highlighting what DMCs should not be doing. Most of our DMCs do face a host of constraints, everything from uneven connectivity to affordable device access, immature cloud procurement and data governance frameworks that Natasha has mentioned, and in general, the digital maturity of the public sector, and then the adoption of digital services, skills issues, as well as, in certain countries where there is data center investment, we will soon face rising power needs issues. And these are all the constraints that we need to overcome or need to help DMCs overcome in order to maximize the adoption of cloud and AI that Raul has advocated earlier. So in terms of what ADB can do and how we can do things better, we do have a few focus areas, or what our digital sector office calls business lines, and we are ramping up. We're ramping up our operational support to DMCs to help them move along the digital maturity journey. First is digital and data infrastructure. Second, and policy and regulatory reforms. Third is digital public infrastructure. And this is different from a physical infrastructure, but rather a cross-cutting, enabling digital platforms that would unlock innovations and adoption of AI-ready or AI-ready applications, and skills and institutional building. So let me just share quick let me just share what we're currently doing in these 4 areas. In digital and data infrastructure, we are supporting our DMCs to enhance their compute and connectivity investment and footprint. And where we need to focus on is really financing energy efficient, climate ready data centers, extend reliable fiber 5G connectivity to, again, support cloud adoptions, and support cloud migration of the government. And we are currently working in countries like Philippines and Indonesia, where we're helping them develop government cloud and data center strategies for this very purpose. We have closed the first green data center investment from our private sector operations, and have a few in pipeline. And as Tom mentioned, what we're supporting is not governments to build a walled sovereign AI infrastructure, but rather, if there is an investment due to the market demand, we want to make sure that these are climate resilient and energy efficient. But on connectivity front, we know the increase in data consumption needs to be supported by continuous upgrade, as well as expansion of the connectivity beyond urban centers, and those are the key focus areas for us. On policy and regulatory reforms, a lot of our governments are in the process or have some kind of AI policy in place. And where we're focusing on is to help them operationalize or unpack this by focusing on some of the building blocks of the policies to support cloud and AI adoption by looking at data protection, their cybersecurity readiness, or how they're looking at cross-border data flow, for example, or whether they have a whole of government cloud policies or open data policies. In terms of DPI, investing in secure digital ID, payment, and data exchange, these will really unlock the data sets that was that will support AI innovations and crowd in private solutions. So again, taking a integrated approach in sovereign and non-sovereign, what Digital Sector Office and ADB is doing is really providing a whole set of menu for governments to understand that this is the area that government needs to focus on, which is often the policy side, and ensuring that we are unlocking and catalyzing private sector investment in areas where they can play a role. Lastly, skills and institutional capacity building points that a lot of speakers have mentioned earlier. We are working with countries like Uzbekistan, Philippines, to help them create a centers of excellence by brokering partnership with world-leading universities and helping them create a research and a prototype workshops through sovereign projects. And there's a lot to be done, and this is an area that ADB cannot do alone, and we are reaching out to different development partners to make sure that we do create impact in upskilling and building institutional capacity. So I'll stop here, but happy to take any questions on what we're doing.
Thanks a lot, Yoonee, and thank you for presenting all the interventions that ADB is already doing in this area. So we'll come back to that maybe later. And now let me finish this round of questions to Jeong. Some of the questions are also linked to questions in the chat, like Zhigang and Emmanuel, more on the basic question of this research. So based on your work, what are the impacts that AI and cloud computing are having on productivity and growth in Asia? And I was wondering if you could say something about the recent developments and how AI exports, it's an important component of Asia's growth in the short and the long run. Thank you.
Okay, so thanks a lot, Rolando, for this question. I can see we have a lot of questions in the Q&A, so I'll try to be quite brief with my response here. So our results show that AI and cloud computing's most significant economic impact is coming from productivity and growth. As was explained in the presentation, we find that a 1% increase in AI spending is associated with a 0.3% GDP increase. Whereas in the case of cloud spending, this is linked to a lower amount of growth in GDP. Now, I think the key thing to bear in mind is that we're talking about general purpose technologies here, so there are lower barriers to adoption, and this can help to more easily reap efficiency gains and also drive innovation across both services and manufacturing. In terms of productivity and the impacts that we find in that regard, I think the AI really complements the cloud impacts through automation, predictive maintenance, and enhanced decision-making across the various sectors that we cover in the analysis. As regards to impact, there are some studies in the literature that find that the impacts on productivity can be in the range of 5 to 5% among early adopters, particularly the case for economies that are advanced in terms of their digital ecosystems, including China, Korea, Japan, Singapore, also India. We find that the impact is somewhat lower at around 3%. And we also have impacts on job creation in relation to AI spending. I think there are some differences in terms of the impacts on skilled worker demand relative to unskilled worker that can be displaced. And I think we basically find that there's an increase in demand for skilled workers, while the opposite is the case for unskilled. Now, there are some differences in when you would look at specific occupations, but overall, that's what we find. Touching on briefly the short term versus the long term, I think in the short term, AI-related investment and exports are really driving what we see in industrial activity and trade growth. But across the region, these benefits are uneven, and many economies continue to face gaps in infrastructure, digital infrastructure in particular, also regulatory issues, regulatory readiness, and skills, digital skills also play a role in that regard. I think over the longer term, there is a huge potential for growth by deepening innovation capacity, fostering new industries, and accelerating the process of structural transformation, which of course would become easier as AI would become more adopted across economies in a more even way. But as I said, this requires investment in digital infrastructure, as well as harmonized data governance, as well as human capital development. Let me stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, John, for these relevant points on the drivers of AI as a driver of productivity. So on the interest of time, we have a lot of questions, so I will try to bundle some of these questions. Albert Park, our chief economist, had some questions on methodology that perhaps we can direct to Raul. And basically the question is, how can we capture these effects on AI through the cross-country analysis, and shouldn't we have more detail on specific types of jobs and tasks? So basically, I think the question is more about the framework of the analysis and whether we need perhaps more in-depth analysis of tasks and other. Over to you, Raul.
Yeah, I mean, obviously there's, I would say, the two bodies of work that relate to the impact of employment. One is generally the one that we're approaching, which is more of the cross-sectional econometric models, which, by the way, we're pretty careful in terms of the robustness checks in order to make sure that we don't incur some of the biases that are characteristic in this kind of research. The other type of work is the one that focuses, as Albert mentions, on tasks and occupations, which sort of a body that started with Frey and Osborne in the 2013, I believe, for earlier technologies, that has been conducted later on. The issue that we're dealing with is, I think that we try to find a convergence between both. I've done some work on the tasks and occupations, not necessarily in Asia Pacific, but in other regions of the world. And I still see that there is some impact. The problem that we have, again, is that labor force statistics generally lag quite a bit in terms of giving us a glimpse of the understanding of what some of the effects are, generally because they're produced on an annual basis and they lag probably a year or two relative to the kind of trends that we are understanding. And then clearly we have the case study data. And case study data goes both ways. We've seen data that pushes for, at the case study level, substitution of unskilled workers or expansion of the capabilities of unskilled workers. So I think that we're in the middle of the discussion right now. The fact is that at this point in time, we're very early to determine what the net impact is going to be. I'm very cognizant of the fact that some of the case study data done from people at Stanford, MIT, and the like would indicate that the effects are more nuanced than what the econometric level, the econometric analysis might indicate. The other point that I'm very careful to underline is that our panels finish on 2023. And again, we're talking about having a 1-year data of the adoption of generative AI, and this is going to take some time. This is going to take some time, and to some degree, unfortunately, economic research informs policy, but I'm very sympathetic with policymakers that have to make decisions in light of the data that is somewhat being generated little by little. But we are at the beginning. Going to the economic impact of AI, I think that our ranges are pretty much in the, our estimates are in the range of what Acemoglu has, Darren Acemoglu has estimated as well in his work. Again, we might have some returns to scale, where with increased adoption, we're going to have larger economic effects. But so far, this is what our analysis indicates, and we're in the range of impact. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Raul. Just a question perhaps on, there are a couple of questions from ADB colleagues, Akiko and Abdul, on what are the implications for inequality. So we have talked a lot about the growth effects, but we haven't touched too much on the inequality question. I was wondering if you had maybe a say on that topic, also from your findings. Perhaps Tom or Jeong, would you like to come in, or Natasha? Please just...
Yeah,
Tom, yeah.
Let me just quickly touch upon this very important topic. Of course, we know that digital divide, right, is a very serious issue and a very major cause of inequality. Now, the issue with the AI is that it's moving so quickly, right? It's advancing so quickly. It's amazing that ChatGPT was launched, I just Googled a few minutes ago, was launched only in November 2022, even though it seems like we've been using it for years and years, right? So what that means is because of the lightning speed of technological progress, the danger or risk of this AI divide is going to be much larger and much more serious than even digital divide. So really, of course, private sector has a role to play too, but the government really has to play a big role, a central role in providing for the general population at least some measure of basic AI education. I think companies and the private sector can do a lot of AI training for their workers because it's in their self-interest, but I think the burden is on the government to provide at least some basic AI training throughout the population. Back to you, Rolando.
Thanks a lot, Tom. We have two questions from Romulo and Jose on the Philippines. Perhaps we can touch on that. One of the questions is about is the Philippines moving towards expanding adoption of AI or more towards sovereign AI? And also some examples or findings of the effects of AI on GDP in the Philippines. So does anyone would like to address these questions for the case of the Philippines? Perhaps Yoonee, will you have something?
Sure, let me give it a try. I actually like to start by saying that there isn't a clear definition of what sovereign AI is, and I think what Tom was referring to was again having the digital and data infrastructure within the country's own national borders, which is again doesn't really make economic sense. But in terms of a lot of the sentiments of government, including the Philippines, is that they do want to have a control over their own digital future by strengthening the AI capacity, and that includes everything from maximizing the use of AI to building small language models, as well as being able to capture all the different dialects that are spoken in the Philippines, and for their AI-enabled services to be able to serve people using different dialects, for example. So adoption of AI, that's for sure. We're working closely with Department of ICT, as well as Department of Development, DepDev, in supporting their AI policies, as well as Department of Trade and Industry in supporting their AI labs, and then the University of the Philippines. So adoption of AI is a big focus of ADB in supporting. In terms of sovereign AI, as a development bank, we do need to be respectful of the country's, the government's wishes, but also helping them navigate and avoid mistakes of creating a walled garden by promoting best practices, promoting competition and adoption of cloud, which does require cross-border data flow.
Thank you, Yoonee.
I'll stop here.
Yeah. Thank you. We have also a question, very interesting, by Gigi on governments. Perhaps I think Natasha could speak on this. Many governments and companies have already invested in cloud infrastructure, and they view AI as the lever to recoup that spending. In your experience, what are the biggest pitfalls or failure modes in expecting AI to pay off for cloud investments? And can you point to cases where AI attempts to haven't been successful, or how do you guard against that in the public sector and the national scale deployments?
Thanks. So I think it's a little premature to conclude that adoption of AI has not been successful. I think we're at the moment seeing the exact opposite, where we're actually seeing very measurable and significant impacts. And as Raul had mentioned earlier, we're very much at the beginning of this journey. Right, we have seen over the last 2 years. I mean, what has been the most visible has been the adoption of, general purpose consumer-based AI tools. But now what we're seeing is actually scale up of AI across all sectors of the economy. You may be interested. There was a survey recently done of organizations across 9 countries in Asia Pacific, and 92% of these, and I'm happy to share the link to that. I mean, 92% of these organizations plan to have AI-powered solutions in their organization within the next 3 years. So we're seeing a definite upswing in the adoption of AI. We're also seeing it very much in governments. A week ago, I was in Singapore, where the government of Singapore had spent an entire day explaining how they were embedding AI into workflows across the whole of government, across multiple sectors for the economy. So, I mean, Singapore is, of course, an example of a great digital maturity, but we're also seeing this in Malaysia. We're seeing this, there was an AI stakeholders summit in Manila at the beginning of this week. So we're definitely seeing this rolling out. I think an important part of that, and somebody was mentioned by a few speakers earlier, the skills dimension is really critical. So we have to, and I think this is where the partnership, say, with ADB, with companies such as ourselves, with governments, is really critical in a concerted effort to upskill people, not only in the technical side of AI development and deployment, but also in how to manage these tools effectively. And that's where we'll see the productivity gains and the impacts. Now, on the negative side, just so I don't overlook that completely, we have to make sure that the risks are effectively managed. So we are, for example, very much invested in the concept of responsible AI, sound AI governance, ethical and fair use of AI. And that is also something that will be a big part of how successful AI is in transforming economies. Thank you.
Thank you, Natasha. We have only 2 minutes left, but perhaps the last question I will address it to Raul to go back to the motivation of this webinar. Some of the questions want to know more about the interaction between cloud computing and AI, and why is it so important to look at them together and the interactions between them. So I was wondering if you could conclude on that, and also on what is the future in terms of topics, research, analysis that you think it would be important for addressing and studying the AI dynamics.
No, good questions. Yeah, the interaction is critical, and I mean, I could expand myself, but just look at the number of deals that are being announced almost on a daily basis between the firms that are actively developing AI foundational models and the acquisition of NVIDIA chips or AMD chips because of the requirements that exist for provisioning the computing power for developing and implementing these applications. There's no such thing as something that could be done independently. And I have to say, there is really a need to keep on updating that. And this is sort of like explained by the number of deals that exist almost on a daily basis, be it by Anthropic or OpenAI, or even yesterday I saw some by Amazon Web Services. So there is the interaction. Secondly, from a methodological standpoint, I saw it in some of the questions, we do address the interaction of both cloud and AI in our models. So we build a composite term that is linked between the interaction of both technologies, because we consider that that has to be dealt in an integrated fashion and not separately. Maybe, obviously, the time that I had allotted didn't allow me to expand too much on some of the details of the econometrics. And that being said, and to your last point, Rolando, I think that we are just beginning on the analysis of this. One area that we're puzzled is why don't we see an impact on capital productivity in our own work? We were expecting total factor productivity impacting both, so at least some portions of the labor force as well as capital, and we still don't see it in the numbers. Our hypothesis is that so far deployment is more focused on sort of levering the productivity of the labor force and not on the effectiveness with which you deploy fixed capital. But that being said, I think that's something that we would like to expand. In addition to the fact that, as Natasha was saying, I believe Tom was saying too, we are at the early stages of some of this, and it just the review of the literature indicates that the macroeconomic assessment is just a beginning body of work, and I'm not trying to underestimate the value of case study analysis on the microeconomics of this, or even the historical experience. But the more access that we have to longer time series and the ability to build panels would be clearly very important for us to understand ultimately what are we dealing with. Preliminary data and results indicates that this is very important. And we are in the range of whatever some of the larger studies are indicating.
Thank you, Raul. It's just the beginning, as you say. So let me thank our presenter and all our panelists for this very insightful discussion today. And before we close our seminar, I would like to invite you also to our next Asian Impact webinar on unlocking nature for development that will take place on the 30th of October, Manila time. So please do check our webinar webpage and our Chief Economist account for more updates. Thank you, everyone, and to our audience and the active participation, and see you again.